The 10 worst years in human history. Today we're going over the 10 worst years in human history. And when I say worst, I don't mean, oh no, my phone battery died at 3%. I'm talking about years when millions of people died, entire regions were devastated, crops failed, empires collapsed, diseases spread, and humanity collectively looked at the calendar and thought, yo, let's just pretend this year never happened. Now there is no scientifically perfect way to rank the 10 worst years in history. Human suffering can't be measured with one number. So this list focuses on years connected to enormous death tolls, famine, war, disease, environmental disasters, and major civilizational disruption. And we're starting with number 10. Number 10, 1600. We're starting with the year 1600. And this was the year Huaynaputina erupted in what is now southern Peru. And this wasn't a small eruption. Huge amounts of ash and volcanic gases were blasted into the atmosphere. When sulfur reaches the upper atmosphere, it can reduce the amount of sunlight reaching Earth. And that can cause temperatures to fall, which is terrible news for farmers. Huaynaputina devastated nearby communities. Ash covered large areas. Crops were destroyed. Livestock died. And the environmental effects continued long after the eruption itself. Climate conditions became unusual in different parts of the world, contributing to harvest problems and food shortages. Imagine living in 1600. No satellite, no weather forecast, no idea what caused the strange weather. You look toward the sky and see ash everywhere. Then your crops start dying. At that point, you probably start wondering if the apocalypse has arrived. So 1600 earns number 10. Not because the entire world collapsed, but because one enormous eruption added another layer of misery to already vulnerable societies. Number 9, 1315. Now let's travel back almost 300 years. To 1315. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the worst famines in medieval European history. Europe experienced extremely wet weather. Heavy rain damaged fields. Crops failed, grain production collapsed, and food prices exploded. The problem was that medieval agriculture had almost no backup plan. Today, if one region has a terrible harvest, food can be imported from somewhere else. In the 14th century, good luck with that. If your harvest failed, you were in serious trouble. And if it failed again the following year, things became even worse. Livestock began dying because there wasn't enough food. That meant less meat, less milk, and less fertilizer for future crops. Malnutrition weakened people. Disease became more dangerous. Crime increased, and social tensions grew. The poorest people suffered first, but eventually the crisis reached wealthy households too. The famine devastated parts of England, France, Germany, and other areas of northern Europe. People were forced to eat whatever food they could find. So imagine being a medieval farmer. You plant your crops, you wait, and then the sky decides to ruin your entire business model. 1315 earns number 9. Because sometimes humanity doesn't need an invading army. It just needs the rain to refuse to stop. Number 8, 1258. Now we're going even further back. To 1258. Scientists have strong evidence that a massive tropical volcanic eruption occurred around this time. The exact volcano is still debated, but the eruption was enormous. Huge quantities of sulfur entered the atmosphere. Temperatures dropped. Weather patterns changed. And agriculture suffered. Europe experienced unusually cold and wet conditions in the years that followed. Harvests failed. Food became scarce. And famine followed in several regions. Medieval societies were extremely dependent on agriculture. There was no global food distribution system. If crops failed in your region, you couldn't simply import food from another continent. You had to hope someone nearby still had enough. And if the weather was bad across a huge area, that became extremely difficult. Imagine being a farmer. You plant your crops. The weather gets colder. The harvest gets worse. You try again. The weather gets worse. At this point, you probably start thinking the sky has a personal grudge against your family. So 1258 earns number 8. A year when a massive volcanic eruption helped create serious climate problems across enormous distances. Number 7. 1816. Now we're jumping forward to 1816. And this year became known as the year without a summer, which sounds like a terrible tourism advertisement. Come to Europe. Beautiful scenery, historic castles, and absolutely no summer. The cause was the enormous eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. Tambora released huge amounts of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. The following year, temperatures dropped across many regions. Frost appeared during the growing season. Snow fell during months when people expected sunshine. And crops failed. In parts of North America, people experienced frost in June. Europe also suffered food shortages. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Europe had just survived the Napoleonic Wars. Millions of people were already exhausted. Economies were damaged. And then nature basically said, "Congratulations on surviving the war. Here's winter in July." But 1816 also had one strange cultural consequence. Mary Shelley and Lord Byron were staying near Lake Geneva. The weather was so miserable that they spent much of their time indoors. During this period, Mary Shelley developed the idea that became Frankenstein. So one of the world's most famous horror stories was partly inspired by humanity having an absolutely terrible summer. 1816 therefore gets number 7. The year when summer basically forgot to show up. Number 6. 1942. Now we're entering the 20th century. And things get much darker. 1942 was one of the deadliest years of the Second World War. The war had already been raging since 1939. But by 1942, it had become truly global. Nazi Germany controlled much of continental Europe. Japan controlled enormous territories across Asia and the Pacific. The Soviet Union was fighting Germany. And millions of civilians were trapped in occupied territories. This was also one of the darkest periods of the Holocaust. Nazi Germany and its collaborators were systematically murdering Jewish people across Europe. Millions would ultimately be killed. Roma, disabled people, political opponents, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, and many others were also persecuted and murdered. Meanwhile, the military war was reaching enormous proportions. The Battle of Stalingrad began. The North African campaign continued. And the Pacific War expanded dramatically. Civilians suffered from bombing, starvation, forced labor, executions, and displacement. The terrifying thing about 1942 was that so many disasters were happening at the same time. Europe was fighting. Asia was fighting. Africa was fighting. The Pacific was fighting. And millions of people were dying. Humanity had taken the technological progress of the industrial age and used much of it to become far more efficient at killing each other. 1942 earns number 6. One of the darkest years of the deadliest conflict in human history. Number 5. 1918. Now we move to 1918. And this year combined two catastrophes that would have been devastating individually. World War I and a global pandemic. The war had already killed millions since 1914. Then a deadly influenza pandemic spread around the world. It became known as the Spanish flu, although Spain wasn't responsible for causing it. The virus spread incredibly quickly. and unusually large numbers of young adults died alongside children and elderly people. The exact death toll is uncertain, but historians generally believe tens of millions died. Many estimates place the total around 50 million or more. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses became sick. Schools closed. Businesses closed. And some communities didn't even have enough healthy people left to perform essential jobs. And remember, World War I was still happening. Millions of soldiers were living in crowded camps. Military ships and troop trains transported people around the world. The war had accidentally created a perfect transportation system for a deadly virus. Imagine surviving years of trench warfare. You survive artillery, machine guns, gas attacks, enemy soldiers, and then you come home, only to discover that a microscopic organism has entered the battlefield. And this enemy doesn't care which uniform you're wearing. 1918 therefore earns number 5, because humanity was already fighting its largest war ever. And then a microscopic enemy joined the fight. Number 4, 1348. Now we arrive at one of the most terrifying years of the Middle Ages. 1348. This was the year the Black Death spread rapidly through much of Europe. The plague had reached Europe in 1347. But by 1348, it was devastating enormous numbers of communities. The disease was caused by Yersinia pestis. It could spread through flies associated with rodents. Once plague entered a community, the results could be horrifying. People developed fever, weakness, and painful swollen lymph nodes. And death could come very quickly. There were no antibiotics. Doctors didn't understand bacteria. And there was almost no effective treatment. Some communities lost huge portions of their populations. The Black Death eventually killed tens of millions of people. Historians estimate that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population may have died. Imagine a village with 1,000 people. Then the disease arrives. 100 become sick. Then 200. Then 500. Eventually, there may not even be enough healthy people left to bury the dead. Farmers died. Merchants died. Priests died. Doctors died. Government officials died. The people who were supposed to keep society functioning were being killed too. And because nobody understood germs, people searched desperately for explanations. Some blamed foreigners. Some blamed religious minorities. And this led to horrific persecution. The Black Death wasn't just a medical disaster. It was a social and economic catastrophe. Labor became more valuable. Trade was disrupted. Villages were abandoned. Families disappeared. And European society was permanently transformed. 1348 earns number 4. Because this wasn't simply an epidemic. It was a demographic earthquake. Number 3, 1520. Now we reach a year that is sometimes forgotten when people discuss the greatest disasters in history. 1520. This was the period when epidemic disease began devastating indigenous populations in the Americas during the Spanish conquest. Smallpox spread through populations that had little previous exposure to Eurasian diseases. In central Mexico, the disease spread during the Spanish invasion of the Aztec Empire. The epidemic killed enormous numbers of people, including Cuitlahuac, the Aztec ruler who succeeded Moctezuma. The disease arrived at an incredibly important moment. The Aztec Empire was already fighting the Spanish invaders and their indigenous allies. Then smallpox began spreading. The Spanish conquest was not simply a small group of Europeans defeating millions of people through military power alone. Indigenous alliances and rivalries played a major role. But epidemic disease was another enormous factor. The peoples of the Americas had developed separately from Eurasia for thousands of years. That meant they had different histories of exposure to infectious diseases. When diseases such as smallpox arrived, the consequences could be catastrophic. And this was only the beginning. Over the following decades, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases spread throughout the Americas. Population losses were enormous. The exact numbers remain debated. But there is no serious doubt that epidemic disease caused catastrophic mortality among indigenous populations. The terrifying part is that the people carrying these diseases often didn't understand what they were carrying. Nobody was sitting on a Spanish ship thinking, "Excellent. Today I shall unleash smallpox upon the Americas." They were carrying invisible biological threats without even knowing it. 1520 earns number 3. Because it marks a crucial moment in one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Number 2, 541. Now we're getting very close to number 1. And number 2 is 541. The beginning of the Justinianic plague. The disease appeared in the Mediterranean world around 541 and spread through enormous parts of the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Again, the culprit was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium associated with the Black Death centuries later. The plague reached Constantinople, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. People became sick. People died. Bodies accumulated. And the government struggled to manage the disaster. The historian Procopius described the catastrophe in terrifying detail. And the pandemic didn't simply disappear. It returned in waves over subsequent decades. The timing was disastrous for the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Justinian wanted to restore the former Roman Empire. His armies had already conquered North Africa. They were fighting in Italy. The empire appeared to be expanding. Then plague arrived. Population declined. Tax revenues were affected. Agriculture suffered. Trade was disrupted. Military recruitment became more difficult. The exact death toll remains heavily debated. But there is little doubt that the pandemic was devastating. Justinian was trying to rebuild the Roman world. And nature basically responded. "Nice empire you've got there. Would be a shame if something happened to it." 541 earns number 2. But now we reach the year that has become almost legendary as one of the worst years to be alive. Number 1, 536. Welcome to number 1, 536. The year that looked like Earth itself had decided to turn the lights off. The evidence that something extraordinary happened around 536 is strong. The Northern Hemisphere experienced a major period of cooling. Scientists believe powerful volcanic eruptions were responsible. Large quantities of volcanic material entered the atmosphere. Sunlight was reduced. Temperatures fell. Weather patterns changed. And agriculture suffered. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun appeared to give its light without brightness. Modern climate evidence provides another important confirmation. Tree ring records show extremely poor growth during this period. Crops failed, food became scarce, famine spread, and populations already struggling with political instability now had to deal with a changing climate. But here's what makes 536 especially terrifying. It wasn't simply one bad year. The cooling continued. The 6th century experienced additional volcanic disruptions. And then in 541, the Justinianic plague appeared. So look at the timeline. 536. The climate changes. The sky becomes darker. Temperatures drop. Crops suffer. Food becomes scarce. Then the difficult climate continues. And eventually a massive plague arrives. Climate disaster, famine, political instability, then pandemic disease. And unlike today, nobody could open their phone and search. Why is the sun suddenly so weird? There were no satellites, no climate models, no modern hospitals, no antibiotics. If your crops failed, you were in serious trouble. If disease arrived, you had very few options. And if the climate changed, you probably had absolutely no idea why. That's why 536 has become one of the strongest candidates for the worst year in human history. Not because every person on Earth had the worst year of their life, but because a massive climatic shock struck during a period when societies were already vulnerable. So there you have it. The 10 worst years in human history. 1600. A massive volcanic eruption and climate disruption. 1315. The beginning of the Great Famine. 1258. A gigantic eruption followed by major climate disturbances. 1816. The year without a summer. 1942. One of the darkest years of the Second World War. 1918. World War I meets a global pandemic. 1348. The Black Death devastates Europe. 1520. Smallpox begins devastating indigenous populations during the Spanish conquest. 541. The Justinianic plague begins. And finally, 536. A year associated with darkness, cooling, famine, and disaster. Now obviously, there isn't one objectively worst year in all of human history. Someone living through the Black Death might choose 1348. Someone trapped in the Second World War might choose 1942. Someone suffering through the influenza pandemic might choose 1918. Human suffering doesn't fit neatly into a ranking. But these years show something fascinating about history. Human civilization has survived an almost absurd number of disasters. Volcanoes, famine, war, pandemics, climate shocks, economic collapse. And somehow we're still here. So the next time you think you're having a terrible year, your phone breaks, your internet stops working, you miss an appointment, or your favorite team loses, just remember. At least you're probably not living through 536. Because that year looked at the concept of a bad year and said, "Hold my beer."